The Alpha King saw a human Omega carry his disabled pup, and his life changed forever. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character, Emily Carter. The morning fog clung low to the tree line at the edge of the northern woods, the kind of fog that softened sound and made the world feel smaller than it really was. And Emily moved carefully along the narrow dirt path that separated her modest cabin from the wild territory beyond, her boots damp, her breath slow, her mind already weighed down by the familiar knowledge that she did not truly belong anywhere. As a human Omega living near wolf lands, she had learned to make herself quiet, to observe more than speak, to offer kindness where she could without expecting anything in return, because expectation only led to disappointment. The pack's rules were clear even if no one bothered to explain them to her directly. Weakness was tolerated at best and discarded at worst, and compassion was a luxury reserved for those strong enough to afford it. Emily knew this, had always known this. Yet as she paused near the bend where the trees thickened and the air smelled of wet pine and earth, something tugged at her attention, a faint, uneven sound that did not belong to the wind. She listened, heart steady, senses alert, until she heard it again, a small, fragile whimper, so soft it might have been imagined, and she followed it instinctively, stepping off the path and into the brush without thinking about consequences. There, beneath a fallen branch slick with rain, she saw him, a tiny white wolf pup no bigger than a house cat, his back legs twisted at an awkward angle, his body trembling from cold and exhaustion, his eyes wide but dull with pain-free resignation rather than fear. Emily knelt without hesitation, her knees soaking through, her hands hovering for a second as if asking permission, and in that moment she understood something. Simple and unarguable. This pup had been left behind, not out of cruelty, but out of a belief that mercy could not change fate. She gently slid her jacket off, wrapped it around his small body, and lifted him against her chest, feeling his shallow breathing warm her skin through the fabric. He did not struggle, did not growl, did not try to run, as if he somehow knew she would not hurt him. The woods remained quiet, but unseen eyes watched from the shadows, and far deeper within the forest. A presence both ancient and powerful had already sensed the shift, because this was no ordinary pup, and Emily Carter, with mud on her boots and rain in her hair, had just stepped into a moment that would echo far beyond this lonely stretch of ground. Emily moved slowly, every step measured, as if the forest itself might shatter if she rushed, and the small weight against her chest felt heavier than it should have, not because of pounds, but because of what it represented. The pup's breathing brushed faintly against her collarbone, uneven but steady enough to keep her moving, and she whispered nonsense sounds without realizing it, the kind people used with frightened animals or crying children, soft words with no meaning except reassurance. The trees thickened as she went, branches arching overhead, the light dimming into a gray-green hush that made time feel suspended, and somewhere behind her a twig snapped, not loud, not threatening, but enough to make her shoulders tighten. She did not turn around. She had learned long ago that fear only made things worse, and whatever watched her now had already decided whether she was a threat. The pup stirred slightly, his small head pressing closer into the warmth of her jacket, and Emily adjusted her grip, careful to support his hind legs so they would not dangle. She could feel the unevenness there, the fragile reality that had sealed his fate in the eyes of others, and the quiet anger that rose in her chest surprised her with its intensity. It was not anger at the wolves exactly, but at the idea that worth could be measured so narrowly, that survival alone determined value. The path back to her cabin curved along a shallow creek, no more than 2 feet across, the water clear and cold, and Emily stepped over it. With care, her boots slipping slightly on wet stones before she found her balance. She remembered the warnings she had been given when she first settled here, how people had shaken their heads and told her that compassion near wolf territory was dangerous, that involvement led to consequences, but standing there with the pup breathing against her skin, those warnings felt distant and hollow. The cabin came into view through the trees, small and weathered, smoke barely curling from the chimney, and relief loosened something tight inside her chest. Inside, she moved quickly but gently, laying the pup on a folded blanket near the fireplace, keeping her movements slow so she would not startle him. She fetched clean water, warmed slightly, and dipped a cloth to wipe the mud from his fur, her touch light, almost reverent, and the pup let out a soft sound that might have been comfort. Outside, unseen by her, the forest shifted. A tall figure stood motionless among the trees, eyes fixed on the cabin, on the woman kneeling by the fire, on the small white pup that should not have survived the night. Caleb Blackthorne did not move closer, did not announce himself, because something about the scene rooted him in place, a quiet that cut deeper than any challenge ever had. He had expected fear if his pup were found, or indifference, or at best a calculated attempt to gain favor. But what he saw instead was simple care, unguarded and unclaimed. The woman spoke to the pup as if he mattered, as if there were no hierarchy demanding she justify her choice. And for the first time in years, the Alpha King felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest, not rage, not dominance, but a slow, unsettling awareness that his world had been built on rules that had never once protected what he loved most. He remained in the shadows as the firelight flickered across the cabin walls, watching, learning, and somewhere deep within him, a decision began to take shape, quiet and irreversible. The fire had burned down to a low, steady glow by the time Emily finished tending to the pup, and the cabin settled into a quiet broken only by the soft crackle of wood and the gentle rhythm of his breathing. She sat back on her heels, arms resting loosely around her knees, watching the rise and fall of his small chest as if committing it to memory, and only then did the weight of what she had done begin to sink in. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, not because she regretted it, but because the world beyond her door would not see it as a simple act of kindness. Outside, the forest felt closer than usual, the silence thick, and Emily was not surprised when a shadow shifted near the tree line, tall and unmistakably present even without sound. Her heart did not race, but it did steady, as if bracing itself, and she rose slowly, careful not to startle the pup, moving toward the door with her hands visible and her posture open. When she stepped onto the porch, the air felt charged, cool against her skin, and she finally saw him clearly, the man she had only known through whispers and instinct, standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. Caleb Blackthorne did not look like a monster or a legend in that moment, but like something carved from the forest itself, still and watchful, his presence filling the space without effort. Emily did not bow or retreat. She simply met his gaze, her chin level, her expression calm, and said nothing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them measured not in feet, but in everything they represented, and it was Caleb who moved first, stepping forward just enough that the firelight caught his face, revealing eyes that softened when they flicked past her and toward the cabin interior. "You did not run," he said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, simply stating a fact. Emily shook her head once, her voice steady when she replied that she did not see a reason to. "He is just a pup," she added, the words simple but weighted with meaning, and Caleb felt something shift again, deeper this time, because no one had ever spoken of his son with such unguarded certainty. He asked how the pup was, and she told him the truth, that he was tired, cold, and hurting in ways she could not fix, but alive, and willing to try. The honesty in her answer left no room for illusion or pity, and Caleb nodded slowly, absorbing it. He stepped closer then, careful, respectful, stopping short of the threshold as if acknowledging that this space was hers, and Emily recognized the restraint for what it was, a choice, not a rule. When he finally looked at her fully, his gaze searching, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that this night had altered more than one future. He told her that the pack would have left the pup behind, that it was considered mercy, and Emily did not argue, only said that mercy should not feel so final. The words hung between them, neither challenge nor plea, and Caleb found he could not dismiss them. He glanced once more toward the cabin, then back to her, and made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not take the pup away, not tonight, he said, because the pup had chosen warmth, and perhaps that choice deserved to be honored. Emily felt her breath ease, relief washing through her, and for the first time since she lifted the pup from the forest floor, she allowed herself to believe that she had not acted alone. As Caleb turned back toward the trees, his silhouette dissolving into shadow, Emily understood that the forest was no longer watching her as an outsider, and that whatever came next would not be simple, but it would be shared. Morning arrived slowly, filtered through mist and pale light that crept across the cabin floor, and Emily woke in the chair beside the fireplace with a stiffness in her neck and a quiet sense of vigilance that never fully left. The pup lay where she had placed him, curled tighter now, his breathing stronger than it had been the night before, and when she moved closer, he lifted his head slightly, eyes clearer, tail giving a tentative flick that made her smile despite herself. She warmed a small bowl of broth, diluted and cooled just enough, and guided him gently, patient with his uncoordinated movements, murmuring encouragement as if he understood every word. Outside, the forest felt awake in a different way, not threatening but attentive, and Emily sensed rather than saw that she was no longer alone in her watch. Caleb Blackthorne stood at the edge of the clearing, daylight softening the sharp lines of his presence, and this time he did not remain hidden. He approached openly, steps measured, hands relaxed at his sides, stopping well short of the porch as he had the night before, a silent acknowledgement that the boundary still mattered. Emily met him outside, closing the door carefully behind her, and for a moment they simply stood there, the morning air cool and clean between them. He asked how the pup had fared through the night, and she told him the truth, that he was tired but eating, that his legs would always be weak, but his spirit seemed stubbornly intact. Caleb listened without interruption, his gaze steady, and when she finished he nodded once, a small gesture heavy with acceptance. He told her the pack would notice the pup's absence soon, that questions would be asked, not out of anger but out of tradition, and Emily felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the knowledge that kindness often demanded explanation. She said she would answer whatever questions came, that she had nothing to hide, and the certainty in her voice surprised even her. Caleb studied her then, not as an alpha assessing risk, but as someone seeing another person clearly for the first time, and he realized that her courage was not loud or defiant, but rooted, unshakable. He offered support without conditions, not a command, not a decree, simply the assurance that no one would take the pup from her by force, and Emily accepted it with a quiet nod, understanding the weight of what he had just promised. Together they stepped back inside, the Alpha King lowering himself carefully to the floor near the hearth, his presence filling the small space, yet somehow gentle, and the pup reacted instantly, inching forward with curious determination, nose twitching, tail wagging in uneven bursts. Caleb did not reach out right away. He let the pup come to him, let choice guide the moment, and when the small body pressed against his leg, he closed his eyes briefly, breathing out something old and tight he had carried for too long. Emily watched from a few feet away, struck by the transformation not in him, but in the space itself, the cabin warmer, fuller, as if something fractured had begun to mend. Outside, distant howls marked the passage of the morning, not a call to alarm but a signal of continuity, and Caleb knew that when he returned to the pack, he would carry more than news. He would carry a different understanding of strength, shaped not by dominance, but by care freely given. When he finally rose to leave, he looked at Emily and spoke plainly, telling her that what she had done mattered, that it would not be forgotten, and she believed him, not because he was a king, but because he had knelt on her floor and waited for a disabled pup to choose him. As he disappeared once more into the trees, Emily closed the door gently, returned to the hearth, and sat beside the pup, unaware that the quiet life she had guarded so carefully had already expanded beyond the edges she once knew. The day stretched forward with a restless energy that Emily could feel even without leaving the cabin, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, and she found it hard to focus on simple tasks like washing the few dishes she owned or folding the extra blanket near the hearth. The pup followed her with determined persistence, dragging his hind legs awkwardly, but refusing to be left behind, and each time she glanced down at him, she felt both tenderness and a quiet worry, knowing that his presence would soon draw attention she could not fully control. By late afternoon, the signs were unmistakable. Birds went silent near the tree line. The air shifted, and Emily sensed movement beyond sight. Not hostile but alert, the way a crowd gathers before something important is said. She stepped outside with the pup cradled against her chest, her posture steady, and waited. The first wolves appeared at the edge of the clearing in human form, not rushing forward, not aggressive, but visibly uncertain, eyes drawn again and again to the small shape in her arms. Murmurs passed between them, low and confused, questions unspoken yet heavy, and Emily felt the familiar weight of being judged, of standing alone under scrutiny she had not sought. Caleb arrived last, his presence silencing the quiet tension immediately, and the wolves straightened instinctively, attention snapping into focus. He did not stand apart from Emily this time. He positioned himself slightly beside her, not shielding her, but unmistakably aligned, and that small shift did not go unnoticed. One of the older wolves spoke, careful with his words, asking why the pup had not been returned, why tradition had been broken, and Emily felt the moment tighten like a knot. Before she could answer, Caleb looked at her briefly, a silent question, offering her the choice, and she took a breath and spoke. She explained calmly what she had found, what she had done, and why, not accusing anyone, not defending herself beyond the simple truth that leaving the pup had felt wrong. She spoke of warmth, of trying, of giving him a chance to decide his own will, and though her voice never wavered, the effort it took was real. Some wolves looked away, uncomfortable, others frowned, caught between belief and habit, and the silence that followed stretched longer than Emily expected. Then the pup stirred, lifting his head and letting out a small sound that was neither cry nor complaint, just presence, and something in the air shifted. Caleb stepped forward and spoke with quiet authority, stating that the pup was his son, that his survival was not an inconvenience but a responsibility, and that compassion shown freely was not weakness but clarity. The words settled slowly, not as command but as truth, and Emily watched faces change, resistance softening into reluctant understanding. No one challenged him. No one reached for the pup. The moment passed without conflict, and one by one, the wolves began to withdraw, their questions answered even if their traditions had been shaken. When the clearing emptied, Caleb remained, his gaze thoughtful, and Emily finally exhaled the breath she had been holding. He told her that change never came easily, that discomfort was often the first sign of growth, and she nodded, feeling both exhausted and quietly resolved. As the sun dipped lower and the forest returned to its familiar rhythm, Emily realized that what frightened her most was no longer the pack or their judgment, but the understanding that her life was no longer small or hidden. The path ahead would demand more of her than she had ever intended to give, and as the pup settled contentedly against her, she wondered how many unseen lines had already been crossed, and how many more awaited them both. The days that followed settled into a fragile rhythm, one built on observation and quiet adjustment rather than certainty, and Emily found herself learning the pup's needs through trial and patience rather than guidance. His strength grew in small increments, measured not in distance, but in determination, and she fashioned simple supports from folded cloth and soft leather to steady his hind legs when he tried to move too quickly. Each success, no matter how minor, felt earned, and she praised him with gentle words that made his tail wag with fierce pride. The forest no longer felt distant during these moments, as if it were leaning closer, watching not with judgment, but with curiosity. Caleb returned often, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a single pack member who stayed at a respectful distance, and with each visit the boundaries between their worlds blurred just enough to be noticed. He spoke less than he observed, noting how Emily adapted without complaint, how she never framed her care as sacrifice, and how the pup responded to her presence with trust rather than dependence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the clearing in gold, Caleb asked a question he had avoided until then, asking why she had chosen to live so close to land that offered her no protection. Emily considered the question carefully before answering, explaining that she had not chosen proximity so much as possibility, that the forest was honest in a way towns had never been, and that she preferred solitude to belonging that demanded she shrink. The simplicity of her reasoning unsettled him more than defiance ever could have. In the pack, discussions had begun, quiet at first, then increasingly open, as wolves questioned traditions they had never thought to challenge, and Caleb felt the weight of leadership shift subtly, away from enforcement and toward example. He knew that change would be slow, that some would resist quietly and others openly, but each time he returned to the cabin and saw his son trying again, failing again, and trying once more, he was reminded of why patience mattered. One afternoon, a young wolf approached Emily directly, hesitant but sincere, offering dried herbs known to soothe joints, and Emily accepted them with gratitude rather than surprise, sensing that this small exchange mattered more than speeches ever could. As dusk settled, Caleb stood with Emily near the edge of the clearing, the pup resting between them, and for a moment the future felt close enough to touch. Caleb admitted that he had once believed strength was proven by how much one could endure alone, and Emily replied softly that survival was easier when shared, even if sharing meant uncertainty. The words stayed with him long after he left, echoing through decisions yet to be made. That night, as the forest hummed with life and the cabin glowed faintly against the dark, Emily lay awake listening to the pup's breathing, aware that her quiet existence had shifted into something larger, something that would test her resolve in ways she could not yet imagine. She did not regret it. Instead, she felt a steady readiness settle into her bones, the understanding that kindness, once witnessed, could not be unseen, and that the world beyond her door was already changing, one deliberate step at a time. The shift began quietly, almost invisibly, the way seasons changed without announcement, and Emily only noticed it because the forest no longer felt like a boundary, but a presence that acknowledged her in return. Wolves began appearing at the edge of the clearing not to question, but to observe, standing in small groups, curious rather than critical, and Emily met them with the same steady calm she had always carried, refusing to perform or justify herself. The pup, growing stronger in spirit if not in body, greeted each visit with earnest enthusiasm, dragging himself forward with determination that made even the most stoic watchers soften. Caleb watched these moments from a careful distance, aware that every interaction mattered, that leadership was being tested not through command but through consistency. One evening, as clouds gathered low and the air hinted at rain, a council of elders requested Caleb's presence back at the heart of the pack territory, their message formal and restrained, carrying the weight of concern rather than challenge. Caleb did not hesitate, but before leaving, he stood with Emily near the porch, his voice quieter than usual as he explained that questions were rising, not about the pup alone, but about what it meant that a human Omega had become a point of reference rather than an exception. Emily listened without fear, though she understood the implications, and she told him simply that she would not leave, not because she was stubborn, but because retreat would undo everything that had been built through patience. Caleb nodded, accepting the resolve as fact, and left with a sense of gravity he had not felt since taking his role. At the council, voices rose and fell, not in anger but in unease, elders debating tradition, safety, and precedent, and Caleb answered each concern with measured clarity, describing not what should be feared but what had already been witnessed. He spoke of resilience, of a pup who had learned to trust, of a woman who asked for nothing yet gave stability freely, and he did not defend Emily as an exception but presented her as a mirror, reflecting values the pack claimed to honor but had rarely practiced. The discussion stretched long into the night, unresolved yet undeniably altered, and when Caleb finally returned to the forest path leading back to the cabin, he carried with him the knowledge that leadership had shifted from preservation to possibility. Emily sensed his return before she saw him, stepping outside with the pup bundled against her, rain beginning to fall in fine mist, and she read the weight in his expression without asking. He told her the council would watch closely, that change would come slowly, unevenly, and that not everyone would be ready to accept what was becoming clear. Emily replied that acceptance was not her goal, only honesty, and the simplicity of that answer eased something in him. As rain tapped against the leaves and the cabin roof, Caleb realized that the life he had built on certainty had been quietly reshaped by someone who had never asked to be included, only allowed to remain herself. He looked at the pup, then at Emily, and understood that whatever challenges lay ahead would no longer be faced alone, not because of bonds spoken aloud, but because shared purpose had already taken root, steady and unyielding, in the space between them. The moment of reckoning arrived not with a roar, but with a gathering, deliberate and unmistakable, as wolves began to assemble at the edge of the clearing in numbers too large to ignore, their presence formal rather than threatening, carrying the weight of decision rather than doubt. Emily stood on the porch with the pup nestled against her, his ears twitching at the low murmur of voices, and she felt a steady calm settle over her, the kind that came when fear no longer served a purpose. Caleb stepped forward into the center of the clearing, his posture relaxed yet resolute, and the conversations quieted at once, attention drawn not by authority alone, but by expectation. He spoke without ceremony, acknowledging the time that had passed and the change that had been witnessed, naming it plainly so no one could pretend it had not occurred. He spoke of responsibility, of care extended without condition, of strength measured by what was protected rather than what was discarded, and he did not frame these as new laws, but as truths already proven. Emily listened, aware that his words carried implications she had never sought, and when he turned to her and invited her to speak, she did not hesitate. She did not argue tradition or challenge belief, but described her days simply, the way the pup tried again after each failure, the way patience built trust, the way community formed not through rank, but through consistency. She said that she had never intended to change anything, only to keep a promise she made in the forest to a creature who needed warmth, and that if change had come from that, perhaps it was because the ground had been ready. The honesty in her voice held the clearing still, and for a long moment no one spoke. Then an elder stepped forward, not to accuse, but to ask what would happen next, how the pack would move forward without losing itself. Caleb answered without hesitation, stating that what endured would remain, but what harmed would be questioned, and that the pack would grow not smaller for it, but stronger in ways that mattered. He announced that the pup would be welcomed as he was, without conditions placed on what he might never become, and that Emily would be recognized not as an outsider tolerated by exception, but as a contributor whose actions had already shaped the pack's future. The declaration rippled outward, met first with surprise, then with acceptance that spread unevenly yet undeniably, and Emily felt a quiet astonishment at the realization that she was being seen without performance or pretense. As the gathering dispersed, conversations low and thoughtful, Caleb remained with her, his voice softer now as he acknowledged that the decision would change his life as much as hers, that leadership rooted in care demanded more patience than command ever had. Emily replied that patience was something she understood, and they shared a brief smile that carried more understanding than words. When the last of the wolves disappeared into the trees, the clearing felt different, not emptier but settled, and Emily knelt to set the pup down, watching him move with determined effort toward the place where the forest met the cabin. Caleb observed the scene with a quiet sense of completion, knowing that what had begun as a single act of kindness had become a turning point he could not have forced if he had tried. As dusk fell and the first stars emerged, he realized that the life he once defined by certainty had been reshaped by humility, and that the future, though uncertain, finally felt aligned with the values he had always claimed to lead by. The weeks that followed unfolded with a quiet steadiness that surprised everyone, including Emily herself, as life at the edge of the forest reshaped into something neither isolated nor overwhelming, but balanced. The cabin became a place of gentle movement and shared purpose, visited not out of obligation but respect, and Emily found that her days were no longer defined by caution but by intention. The pup, now known throughout the pack not for what he lacked but for what he endured, learned to navigate the clearing with careful determination, his progress slow yet undeniable, and each small victory drew quiet smiles from those who watched. Caleb visited less frequently but with deeper presence, his time spent listening as much as speaking, his leadership evident not in instruction but in example. He spoke with elders and young wolves alike about patience, about worth that could not be measured by strength alone, and the pack began to reflect those values in ways subtle yet lasting. Emily noticed it in the way wolves waited rather than rushed, in how questions replaced assumptions, and in the space created for differences that once would have been dismissed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the forest in warm amber, Caleb stood beside Emily at the edge of the clearing, watching the pup rest after a long attempt to cross the uneven ground. He admitted that his life had been defined by responsibility without reflection for too long, that he had believed protection meant control, and Emily responded that care often required trust more than command. Their conversation carried no promise or declaration, only understanding, and it was enough. The forest around them hummed softly, the sound familiar and welcoming, and for the first time Emily felt that her presence here was not a quiet exception, but a natural part of the landscape. When Caleb prepared to leave, he paused, looking back at the cabin, at the woman who had changed the direction of his leadership without ever seeking influence, and at the son who had taught him the cost of overlooking gentleness. He thanked her, not as a king granting favor, but as a father acknowledging a truth he could not ignore, and Emily accepted it with a nod that carried no pride, only resolve. As night settled and stars emerged overhead, Emily returned inside, laying another log on the fire and sitting beside the pup as he slept, his breathing calm and sure. She thought about the life she once guarded so carefully, small and contained, and realized it had not been taken from her, but expanded, shaped by choice rather than circumstance. Outside, the forest stood watch, no longer distant or imposing, but connected, and somewhere within it, a pack adjusted its course around a different understanding of strength. Emily rested her hand lightly against the pup's side, feeling the warmth there, and knew that what had begun as a single moment of compassion had become something enduring, a reminder that true change did not arrive with force or spectacle, but through the courage to care when it would have been easier to walk away.